Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Well, yes, indeed, we did say we're going to turn our attention to something else, but this is about security and resettling, ensuring that the IDPs get better, and we approach that particular matter in a different way. Well, Mr. Terrry Lacey joins us now. He's the team leader for MADE, that's the Market Development Program in the Niger Delta. Morning, and thank you for coming on today.
Morning, Tim.
Give us that background. Let's put it in proper perspective. MADE, what do they do?
Okay, MADE is a program that works on encouraging non-oil and non-gas diversification and economic development in all the Delta states, going across from Ondo to Cross River. And I think the reason for the program being set up is because there are two areas of economic pressure and some instability in Nigeria. One is the northeast, as we know, which gets a lot of the publicity because of Boko Haram. And the other area is south and southeast, where in the oil states of the Niger Delta, we've had in the past some serious instability and problems, and that's led to a lot of unemployment and then some actual conflict, and that, as you know, was resolved for a period anyway by the agreements made by the last government with MEND and so on. What that has highlighted is that there's a large number of young men in particular who don't have jobs and who don't have a very secure future yet in the Delta area, and I think the concern of the international community and of the federal government now coming into the new federal government is that if these economic problems, which are essentially also demographic and also to do with sometimes climatic pressures and land pressures, if those pressures, if we don't deal with them, then we get more crime, we get a push towards rapid urbanization, then the crime wave moves sometimes from some rural instability into more crime in the cities, and then it becomes harder to get the inward investment and to do the economic regeneration, which we all want, because there is a transformation going on now in Nigeria. The economy is getting a bit better, and there's a lot of good potential now, and a lot of good things happening in the country. But when you read finally in the newspapers or watch on your program on TV, another set of bad things happen in the northeast or some other bad things happen in the Delta, it tends to undermine a bit the image of the country externally, and it tends to undermine a bit the prospects for organizing well this new wave of investment which we need.
So how does the internally displaced persons affect any of these things you mentioned? Well,
it affects in several ways. I mean, even down in the Niger Delta, we're a long way from the northeast, but we do have IDPs already in Edo State. And I think the big issue is always going to be, do IDPs settle down in the state they've been moved to, or is the objective eventually to regenerate economic development in the area they've come from, because you then get a different security situation, things improve, and you can get back into a normal economic situation with farming and so on. And one of the things that affects the balance between, say, the way the west of Nigeria, the south and southeast work, the northeast and the northwest, if you think just of the balance of the internal fisheries industry and how that affects ordinary people. Fisheries are actually very strong in places like Niger, which may surprise people, New Busra. Fisheries could be very, very strong again around Lake Chad and in the northeast, but that sort of industrial balance and that sort of balance between an industry that creates thousands of jobs in the Delta, in the west and so on, if that industry goes down because security is poor and also because we're not looking after our water resources properly, in the Delta we've got the oil pollution, we've got the need for bioremediation and to tidy up the environment, get the fisheries industry really moving, and if we want a good balance between the fisheries industries in the four main parts of Nigeria, we have to take into account these problems, and that people may get moved away from the areas where they can actually catch the fish. So that we've got to get them back into the areas where they can do their normal jobs. And at the same time, in the areas where people are resettled, if agriculture is not strong, if it's not getting the inputs, if the banks are not interested, if the LGAs and the state governments don't have enough resources at the moment to support properly their budgets as well as their capital budgets and to push money into the agricultural sector, then how are we to stabilize this situation so people have got a good future instead of being dependent as IDPs on international assistance or on forms of aid, because that's not the solution.
Let's talk about the IDPs now. Everything is geared towards inclusive growth that you've talked about, economic growth, so to speak. And you talk about those that are already in the Niger Delta, and some have even migrated from Niger's northeast to places like Edo State. They must be given a chance to grow the economy and also personal growth. So what are those indices that must be put in place? Because you just talked about the grassroots governance, which is the local government input in all of this. What can the local government, as well as those other communities or banks, what can they do to help some of these displaced persons come back, to a better state?
Yes. It's a paradox that in the Delta states of Nigeria, we have the greatest sources of wealth in the country because of oil and gas, and we have a high level of unemployment, underdevelopment, and under poverty. And it's surprising because if you've worked, as I have, in parts of the north and in the Middle Belt, as well as in areas like Ogun,
you're a medical doctor, right?
No, I'm not actually. I'm a doctor of philosophy, and what I studied was related to this a bit because I studied political violence and insecurity in Jamaica, and it taught me a lot about the relationships between youth groups and the society, politics, and about the problems of, in their case, how to try and get the sugar industry and tourism and a balanced economy going in an area of very, very high unemployment, high crime, and high gun crime. Incidentally, a much worse situation than in Nigeria, and it's not fair that people look at Nigeria in that kind of way. It's not true for most LGAs that we have this kind of situation in Nigeria. It's in certain areas. But getting back to this balancing act that I think is needed, if you bring IDPs into an area where there's already a kind of a disconnect, and that's perhaps one of the great features that the Buhari government is now trying to deal with. I remember being here in 1977. I used to live in Togo in 1975, and I saw an almost normally shaped economy compared to the other states of West Africa. By the end of the last century, the economy was very distorted, and a lot of the middle had fallen out, and the development of agriculture was really being neglected in certain areas. So you have this phenomena, especially say in Bayelsa, which is surprising because it's the state of the previous president, of Goodluck, that you have very, very low levels of underdevelopment in areas that have huge wealth, and that compared to other places that sometimes get bad publicity but don't necessarily deserve it, say Plateau, much more developed than some of the states in the Niger Delta. And the only parts of the Niger Delta where agriculture's really got going at the moment is partly in Edo, more in Cross Rivers, and in Akwa Ibom. And in other places it needs a lot of a push to really make it one of the biggest employers and to provide the basis for diversification and processing and get more jobs into the economy. So when you bring IDPs into that kind of area, you firstly got the local problem that we're trying to reconnect this economy and make it work better. And that means right down to the level of LGAs, you need services. Who, for example, is supposed to do agricultural extension? Who is supposed to get out among the farmers and give them a real hand? It doesn't mean they need handouts. The big thing they need is technical know-how and access to know where they can get their inputs, and then more awareness of how to deal with the banks. The reputation of the Nigerian banks is poor because the banking sector is very small in Nigeria compared to most countries. Only 1.5% of all financing in the Niger Delta and in the rest of Nigeria is provided by banks. 98.5% has to come from somewhere else. This is not a normal situation. You can't develop what will be the 10th biggest economy in the world by the middle of the century by having a banking system that only services 1.5% of the financing requirements. It's just miles too small. So IDPs come into an area where the new governors coming in and the new structures coming in can hardly afford their salaries. Their capital budgets are very depleted or they don't exist yet. And we have these huge problems of how to get the infrastructure going, get the roads together, so that these traditional patterns that existed in some of these areas, that there were run-down old state plantations and people only made a living by stealing fruit bunches and going off and processing them. That's not an economy. That's just trying to survive on the edge. And now that you have companies coming in like Akumo who are trying to build up plantations, how do you then get a balance between smallholders, for example, and the big plantations? Who helps to engineer that?
The banks are not keen into all of this project. What about those companies? You just talked about a company that is into palm produce, for instance.
Yes.
So how well have they been able to help some of these people who are in such communities or society?
As the palm oil industry, which we do work with in the program I'm in, gets a bit more regenerated and is trying to push itself forward, trying to get back to a position it was in actually many years ago, then you do see that there's some regeneration on the palm estates, they're being better organized and so on. But the big issue there, and I live in Indonesia when I don't live in Nigeria, and in Indonesia, the largest producer of palm oil in the world, the vast majority of the output is from small farmers, not big estates. It's a very important historical lesson because they got the seeds from Nigeria. But what they do there is run a socially stable structure in which huge numbers of smallholders can have a future in palm oil and work alongside big estates. So one of the things that can happen here is that the smallholders and the people in smaller clusters away from the estates would eventually have the chance to sell into a more redeveloped industry up to the standards of what we call RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Production. And all those kind of standards and all those kinds of ways of organizing can be done here. They're perfectly possible. There's all the brain power, there's eventually the investment coming in, but getting that balance right between the little man, the small people, the small ladies producing palm oil and the bigger estates, that is an important job because you can't get the economic regeneration of Nigeria to work by only putting all the investment in the big things. And then in the small things, the people are still not getting the jobs, not getting the income, and they're saying, well, what's in it for us?
So that's where the focus on the SMEs will come in here.
Yes, yes.
Now, we've been talking about the IDPs, but I'm still trying to get that link. When they come in, are they usually still in camps, or do they just come in small settlements, or how are they absorbed into the society that they try to stay in?
Well, in South and in Southeast, what has happened because of the instability in the Northeast is we've had two kinds of IDP migration, two kinds. One is the official kind where people come and there are attempts to settle them or to put them into places where they stay while they get resettled. But that essentially means, in that case, access to land, access to the means of production, so they can work for themselves, which is what they want to do. And the other kind, which has been a bit scary sometimes, is very informal movement of sometimes quite large numbers of people. And that's caused security scares into one or two states, especially in Southeast, when you suddenly get 20 large buses turning up with a whole load of guys, and they're saying, well, we've come for a job. Well, what does that mean? Are they some sort of excursion trip for some organization in the Northeast? That's what people fear. Or is it just that someone's got a bright idea, there's money, there's nothing up here, let's all go that way? It's a bit reminiscent of what's happening on the edge of Europe now when you get 300,000 people trying to cross the Mediterranean in little boats. I mean, Nigeria is a federation. It's one economy ultimately. Despite some of the discussions about the rights of indigents in one state or another, there's huge movement between areas now. And I think this is part of what the country has to cope with. So this imbalance, both informal and formal IDPs into formal situations and unofficial IDPs moving around the country in quite large numbers, that can only be resolved by local administrations right down to LGA level. And at the moment, the states and the LGAs in the South and Southeast are not particularly resourced for this.
How would you suggest that the states handle it, considering, you've lived in Nigeria for a while, yes, how sensitive these kinds of matters can get. Yes. But how would you say they handle this informal migration?
Well, I think that in the Southeast side, when we've had this large-scale informal migration, then sometimes it's been viewed more as a security problem than an economic problem. But ultimately, it's also an economic problem because you then get people hanging around big bus centers and big markets trying to find odd jobs, and that is actually potentially a problem for crime and insecurity, but also there's a certain amount of absorption going on of labor. If you look even at, say, the leather industry and this huge number of animals crossing normally into the Northeast, and that reaches right down to the leather industry in, say, Abia, then first of all, if the leather supply goes down, the local people don't have enough work, so they need the leather. Secondly, other people coming into areas like that, how are they to fit into an area like that if it's such large-scale informal movement?
Are the governments on this program?
Yes. I think the government is increasingly aware of this issue, and maybe one of the things that's got to happen is that state governments that feel that they are under pressure because they've been asked to settle people formally, like Edo has been. So there are actually arrangements being made for IDPs in Edo, and also the people on the southeast side who have come under pressure from recent examples of mass migration. Into the area.
Very quickly, as a wrap up, I'm asking about the government's input in this, knowing full well that we have the amnesty program in Niger and South. A couple of other people have been taken out of the country. Yes. So, do you have some people that are undergoing training in agricultural business and so many other enterprises within this program?
In programs like mine and in other programs in the Niger Delta, there are people who are already getting access to training and access to awareness on how to work with banks, and actually we are managing to involve the banks, and they are becoming more positive, and that's good. But with regard to the LGAs and the states, I think we need some work, serious work, on how to try and help them stabilize their budgets, and on trying to work with them. Now that we've got over the election period and the political period, we can all settle down a bit and work more with the ministries, departments and agencies. And one of the ways that might be possible in the coming year or two is to see where the international community and the private sector can actually help to do things that the state can no longer do, or to help the state to do things that it still wants to do.
All right, Mr. Lacey, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I hope you have time to, I see some fish all over the place here.
That's right, we can bring you some fish.
We'll be back after the break. Join us again.